Hello everyone, welcome back to this second session. Welcome back to the second session of the 2020 HDR conference. Anna and I will be performing a short little set. Well, it's only one piece, so I don't think that counts as a set. We're going to be playing for you the Mozart Sonata for two pianos in D major, Koshal 448. The theme of the conference is innovation and exploration, if I'm not mistaken. And yet, Mozart is not traditionally considered much of an innovator by the general popular music discourse. That label is reserved for, at least in the kind of Western European tradition, for composers like Monteverdi, Beethoven, Stravinsky. And yet, it's really easy to overlook some of the ways in which Mozart was an innovator. Perhaps the most well-known area is in opera, and the things that he brought to opera, particularly the psychological complexity, this kind of intersection between melody, harmony, texture, form, thematic structure, where he was able to convey quite complex psychological states and interactions, especially interactions between different characters. Instead of having the singular operatic figure delivering an emotional statement, it was often about the dialogue and the interaction. And that's certainly what he brings to this piece for two pianos. I don't think it's not a secret for pianists anyway that opera and operatic thinking completely colored Mozart's, it just infiltrated his keyboard style generally, not just in a superficial way in terms of being very melodic or even being very dramatic in certain cases, but much more deeply. It was so special. So, for example, in this piece, it's really a mini opera in three movements. The first movement is an overture, complete with fanfares, string writing reminiscent of the Marriage of Figaro overture. And even in his overtures, which are supposedly instrumental, he can't help but bring in characterization, as in characters and dialogues. The second movement is an aria, presumably on the topic of love. And the third movement is a finale in the spirit of the Rondo alla Turca. Maybe you can easily imagine it belonging to, or being an alternative finale for the abduction from the Seraglio, with Janissary band type references to drums, cymbals, and things like that. So this is a very innovative work in the context of two keyboard music. There wasn't a lot of two keyboard music written. I think the earliest example might be Giles Farnaby's piece for two keyboards in the Fitzwilliam Virginal book about 170 or 80 years prior to this work. But no one, to our knowledge, had explored the potential for dialogue and interaction between the performers, as Mozart does in this work. Perhaps it had something to do with the fact that it was written for one of his students, Josepha Auenhammer, who must have been pretty good, because he wrote this for a party at her place, and he performed it with her. She was on the first piano and he was on the second piano, which I think explains why, for example, in the second movement, the aria, there's a lot more melodic material for his star student. The only other interesting thing I want to say about this is that he wrote it at the ripe old age of 25, which was probably kind of getting into late career for Mozart. That's all I want to say about that. We'll play it now.
jump up. And you can do this at home as well if you want to. Everyone jump up. We're all going to look ridiculous together for a minute. So, your first task, shake your right leg out. Shake your left leg out. Shake your arms out. Good. A few star jumps. Excellent. Reach up to the ceiling, down to the floor, and you can sit back down. All right. For those of you at home, please just bear with us for a couple of minutes while we get set up for our next keynote with Associate Professor Elizabeth Mackinlay.
Happy to chat. Yeah.
Hi everyone, let's get myself organised. I was very happily sitting at home in my flat in Indooroopilly, watching everyone's presentations and thoroughly enjoying being there, and then just thought, oh, maybe I need to come into uni. So I've raced in, and I'm sorry I wasn't here in person earlier, but it's lovely to be back. I say to be back here because I started lecturing in the School of Music in 1997 as an ethnomusicologist, and it's really lovely to be back in one of my homes. So thank you, Eloise, for inviting me. And what I thought I would like to do today actually is return to my ethnomusicological roots, and both Denis and Eloise asked me if I would talk about ethics. Some of you might know I'm currently chair of one of our central high-risk ethical review committees, and also chair of the HAS Faculty Low and Negligible Risk Committee. So in terms of speaking about ethics, I bring very much an institutional perspective, but also a relational perspective on ethics. And it's actually the relational perspective in relation to ethics that grounds why I do the institutional work. And so maybe today you'll get a little bit of a taste of why that is. Let's put my glasses on. So I'm deviating from my abstract for reasons that I'm sure many of you appreciate, time and other things, but also relevancy for you as a School of Music community. Hi, Denis. So I've called it Got Ethics, an autoethnographic and ethnomusicological conversation. And to begin my presentation, I would like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you on Yagara and Turrbal country and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that this always was and always will be Yagara and Turrbal land, and sovereignty was never ceded. Speaking about music, speaking about ethnomusicology, an acknowledgement of country is particularly significant when we think about the knowledge of song and ceremony and culture that resonates in country, back then, now, and forevermore. And I'd also like to acknowledge that the only reason that I'm standing here today talking to you about ethics from an autoethnographic and ethnomusicology perspective is because of the generosity of Aboriginal and Islander people, particularly my Yanyuwa, Garwa, Mara and Gurindji family in the Northern Territory, and I pay my respects to them as well. So I am going to present this as an autoethnographic performative piece, and I know that Eloise laid the groundwork for that a little bit earlier. So let's begin. Dear unnamed dame of the MacArthur River, I begin this letter by saying sorry. I do not know how else to begin, for it is with the most profound sadness and shame that I am unable to begin this letter by addressing you by your name. I found this photograph of you in the Northern Territory archives in Darwin when I visited there recently, and this is the only identifying information about you available in the records, unnamed dame of the MacArthur River. That's all there is. There is more information held about the man who captured you in this picture. His name was Ted Ryko. Ted was born Edward Frederick Reichenbach to German parents in Woorak, a small town in northwest Victoria, in 1894. At 21 years of age, Ted rode his bicycle from Adelaide to Darwin, stopped to take photographs along the way, and still managed to reach his destination in the record time of 28 days, 15 hours and 30 minutes. Upon arriving in Darwin, Ted opened a photographic studio in the CBD and travelled far and wide across the Northern Territory, including the Gulf region where you lived, taking snaps of this and that and those. He reportedly took thousands of photographs of Aboriginal people, but they were stolen from his home some years later, and only 100 or so extremely rare and sought-after images remain. Your photograph is one of them. I've spent hours and hours looking at this photograph of you, thinking and wondering about who you are and why Ted Ryko did not write down your name. Did you know this image would capture you in time, contain you in an archive, and remember you only as an unnamed object to be catalogued and gazed at? Did Ted ask your permission before he snapped this moment in the past, and with that, your connection to country and family in the future? I'm never quite sure if you were smiling in this photograph. Your look gives away nothing about how you felt having your picture taken, or for that matter, Ted Ryko. I've just started my PhD in ethnomusicology, studying the musical culture of your people, Yanyuwa, Garwa, Mara and Gurindji, who live at Borroloola on the MacArthur River. And I believe that you may possibly be related to some of the people I'm about to meet, including my partner's family. I'm undertaking my first fieldwork trip there in July this year, and I'm going to take this photograph with me in the hope that someone will recognise you. I will write to you with news when I return. Yours sincerely, Elizabeth Mckinlay. Got ethics? I whisper my inquiry quietly. An uncomfortable silence descends upon the room like a heavy and damp woolen blanket, cold, clammy and itchy. I watch my mind as body as mind positions shift in an attempt to ease the scratching. Legs cross and uncross themselves to settle feet that jiggle up and down in an edgy dance. Blushing faces look downwards to hide from the question. If I don't look at you, I hear you say, then you won't be able to look at me. You won't be able to see me, really see me. You won't be able to look into my eyes. You won't be able to see the secrets that are hiding truths. You won't be able to see the truths that are hiding the answers you seek. Got ethics? I ask again a little louder. I want to make sure my question is heard. Blank eyes stare back at me. Avoid at all costs. Ignorance is bliss. Don't mention the C word or the F word for that matter. Do you even know what they are? What goes on in the field stays in the field. Never mind the field notes, they become field knots. If nobody names it, it remains not thing, nothing, no body, no thing. Got ethics? If nobody will answer no thing, I decide I will ask myself, why is this question full of such angst? It's angst-ridden. The question is riddled with angst. They need not even say. The angst sits there in and of itself, riddling away. Once diagnosed, the question dies quickly, riddled as it is with the angst. So rapidly is it riddled, in fact, that there's no time to answer it. Once named as angst, the question becomes a riddle in and of itself. Impossible to answer not right, impossible to answer not wrong. What happens? if my ethics, if I am either? Can I unforget the moment I first asked myself to answer, got ethics? I'm searching for the first letters and words and notes and memories that write my ethical arrivance in ethnomusicology. I bend down and pull out a bright purple archive box, appropriately labelled Field Notes, sitting on the bottom of my office cupboard, and dump it on the floor. They are the remnants of thinking and wondering in 1993 and 1994, before and after what I once thought of as arriving at Borroloola. One by one, I pull out the contents, and before long, the carpet is littered with sheets and reams of variously yellowing and browning loose A4 paper. There is nothing unforgettable about these documents. The paper is old and plain, the handwriting is plain and neat, the ink is blue and plainly clear on thin, faint and straight blue lines. The staples which hold some together are plain, and the paper clips on others are plainly rusted, and they smell quite plainly like papers which have been secreted away at the bottom of a cupboard for quite some time. Perhaps the only unforgettable thing is the unforgetting they document, and that despite the discolouring of the paper itself, the writing is legible. The order the papers are placed in the box, however, is not. They seem to have been thrown in without remembering rhyme or reason, and they probably were. Most sheets have a date entered on the top right-hand corner, but some don't. Some papers have the names of people and places scribbled in the centre not far away, but most don't. A quick glance down at one of these pages tells me that this detail is hidden, living in secret somewhere under the academic story that wants to hide these memories. The type of writing I decided might belong in this bright purple archive box labelled Field Notes is similarly forgetful. There are letters to family and friends, faxes to colleagues, yes, faxes, notes from advisory meetings, writing labelled journal entries, fragments of musical transcriptions, quotes from academic papers, and drafts of research questions. Journal entry, 14th of October 1993. I had a meeting with my PhD advisor today, a good discussion about where I'm at with my thesis work and where I need to go next. And that place is a research question. I need to find one. I could start with, have Yanyuwa women taken over custodianship of men's song? Very quickly this becomes, have they also taken on the musical structures of men's song? A number of sub-research questions arise from this concerning matters that I've been dealing with in my research so far, and these may form chapters. My advisor and I thought this was a good beginning list. What are the performance rules for Yanyuwa women's song? Is there any rhythmic encoding? Which came first, text, rhythm, or melody? I am ever so keen to gather some more musical material for transcription. My advisor mentioned that I should be doing an hour of transcription a day, and some of you might remember Carolyn Ellis. She was my advisor at that time. The ethnomusicologist rule. I'll start tomorrow, I promise. And that includes analysis. Tomorrow, I will follow up with a search for material. Tomorrow. Another scrap of writing finds its way into my hands. I'm staggered by how many snippets of this and that there are, and not only how many, but how much I wrote before I had even arrived. There is so much writing about Borroloola sitting in the bright purple archive box. The following is an account of issues, I read at the top of one sheet. Questions to be answered in fieldwork, headlines another. Here's the catch. I know that there and then when I wrote those words on paper, I held them to be so much more than snatches of thinking and wondering. They were pieces of writing that declared a certain knowing about a place I had never even been, people I had never met, and songs I had not really ever heard except on a recording. I took a closer look at the particular notes I'm currently holding on to. They are from a research meeting dated the 20th of December 1993 with my advisor and colleagues. They begin like this. It was decided that fieldwork will not be carried out until the middle of May, when the wet season will be well and truly finished, making access to Borroloola and associated areas much easier. See? Just look at the grammar, spelling and expression. I look at it now and see it's all wrong, all of it, and it continues. Also, at this time of year, people are more relaxed and at ease, more willing to sing and perform as the weather becomes more tolerable. It's an interesting word, isn't it? More relaxed, more willing, more tolerable. It seeks to go further and farther than what is to become another, added to and greater, and wait, all of the mores here. I see the word more now as more than one and turn towards the multiple. It speaks a different kind of meaning, one that whispers ever so gently and yet with a warning, words about encounters and elsewhere and ethics. Most loudly and insistently, words about ethics. It is hoped we will be able to stay at an outstation called Wonanula. Not a good idea to stay in town. There are some knowledgeable people staying at Wonanula, including Denis McDinney, Eileen Nancy and Rachel McDinney, quite willing to help us in our work. I'm going to write to them, asking permission to come and stay with them to study their music further. And there they are, the words I wrote, in black and white, so much less than the mores I had been looking for. There and then the words that followed all kinds of academic rules in relation to researching and writing that were not in fact kind at all. These words assumed and assured me of my authority to arrive, and being in a relation association they might have held was absent and away. Here and now, the words blanket shame on me, and shame it is. Unforgetting these moments of white settler colonial privilege is excruciating. Even more so because how can I be sure I am any different here and now writing these words and sharing them with you than I was there and then writing those words? With a feverish desperation, I toss and throw the papers in the bright purple archive box about until I find what I'm looking for. It is a copy of a letter dated the 2nd of January 1994, addressed to Denis, Eileen, Nancy and Rachel McDinney at Wonanula, care of the Borroloola Post Office, Borroloola, Northern Territory, postcode 0854. The letter is from me to them, Miss Elizabeth Mckinlay, care of the Music Department, the University of New England, Armidale, New South Wales, postcode 2351. It is typed in large Times New Roman font. Dear Denis, Eileen, Nancy and Rachel, I'm a friend of John Bradley's, studying Aboriginal song at the University of New England, Armidale, New South Wales. John has kindly let me listen to some of his recordings of Yanyuwa Wallabara and Akaria performances. I found the singing and performances to be most interesting and exciting, and I would like to have the opportunity to hear more Yanyuwa song. I am wanting to know if it would be possible for myself and a linguist at the university to come and visit you at Wonanula to learn more about Yanyuwa song and Yanyuwa song performance. I'm looking forward to hearing from you soon. Yours sincerely, Elizabeth Mckinlay. I turned back to my bright purple archive box looking for a reply from Denis, Eileen, Nancy and Rachel McDinney. There is nothing there. Here she is. An elderly man ambles over to the camp chairs where my mother-in-law Jeannie and her mother Hilda are resting. It has been a long, hot day sitting in the back of a troop carrier to get to Borroloola from Darwin, and with a cup of white sweet bush tea in hand and dents of the long, hot drive. Oh, my boy Denis. Hilda stands up slowly, but her smile is fast. She embraces Denis McDinney, a senior Garawa man, and the moment they touch, there is a subtle shift in the air. Time stretches out of shape. The heat of the sun grows soft. The crows quieten and croon. The essence of family in kinship on country is all of a sudden everywhere. Jeannie waits to be welcomed. She knows the law. Who is this? Mr. McDinney asks, pointing his lips at me. Hilda waves me over to them. Oh, this is my grandson's wife. She places her thin arm around my shoulder. I gotta call you Granny then, he chuckles. You're my googity. I see the Yanyuwa kinship diagram I've memorised in my head. If I close my eyes, I can see the chart clearly, the names and the relationships. Yakamari marries Nungarima, our daughters are called Naminyama, and our sons are called Kangala. Jeannie is Nulanma, and Hilda is Nimarama, and that makes... Well, the chart tells me that Denis McDinney is my maternal grandson. I call him Wugugu. This is Liz, Hilda continues. She's the, what did you say you were? I'm the I stammer. I'm the ethnomusicologist from the... Hilda interrupts and translates. Yeah, that's right. She's the music researcher that wrote to you. Denis reaches forward and shakes my hand. Welcome to my country, Googity, he says, placing his hand on his heart. to her country. He holds Hilda's hand in his other. He steps to one side and takes a look at the luggage and supplies piled high inside the back of the troop carrier. He's looking for something. Well, did you bring your tape recorder, my girl? I nod. You're good. Denis seems pleased, because I've some songs that I want to sing for you. We can start tomorrow, Baldi Butter. He turns then and walks away, humming loudly, not quite under his breath. Got ethics? You see, I thought I had done the right thing. I had written a letter on our behalf. I had the family connections. It was my role. It was my responsibility, they said. Dear Mr. McDinney, a note on official university letterhead that said the ethnographers shall be arriving. 1 by 2 by 3 of a kind. Dance ethnographer, ethnomusicologist, and then linguist. We did not ask. We said we would, and we did arrive at the beginning of July in 1994. Got ethics? The research team in the research car, complete with research matter. Funding, field notes and files, fueled to find. You see, once we arrived, I thought I was doing the right thing. Funding, field noting, filing, finding, that's what I was there for after all. Never mind the ethics. Finding, keeping, mind over matter. Got ethics? We can pay you by the hour for singing your culture. $25 is the going rate. Unless you'd prefer another payment method, blankets, flour, tobacco, no problem. It's your preference, your choice, your empowerment. Oh, white goods it is then. Got ethics? I ask again loudly. I watch, I wait for an answer. I watch empty promises waft and curl their way high into the sky with tobacco smoke. I wait for the blankets to smother the fire that fuels the finding, field noting and filing. The research matters begin to fill the research team and the research car, melodies and moves, all on tape, all on the record, all on the way, away to elsewhere, out of sight, out of mind. Possible because payment has been made. Got ethics? You see, once we got down to the real ethnographic work, finding, field noting and filing culture that mattered more, that's when the question was asked, Dear Mr. McDinney, do you give your permission? Will you give your permission? If you say no, never mind, we can ask someone else. We will ask someone else because we have arrived. 1, 2, 3. The woman arrives 15 minutes late to the workshop. She enters the room noisily, pointing and pushing her way through to the centre chair in the centre row of chairs in the centre of the room. She makes no apology as her satchel swings and sways into the bodies of others she passes by. She is focused solely on locating her presence in the centre of the room. Elizabeth stops midway through her introductory and definitional slide titled, What is Autoethnography?, to acknowledge the woman's arrival. Welcome, we've only just started. Please take one of the handouts. The woman reaches across the rows of people in front of her and snatches the printed sheets from Elizabeth's hand. Well, I'm not so sure I'm going to need this, but let me say you are very lucky I found you. This campus is a nightmare to navigate, and the map, don't get me started on the inadequacy of the directions you gave to get here. The woman says angrily, If I didn't know better, I think you could have almost fooled me into deliberately misleading me. Elizabeth is lost for words. She has no idea who this woman is and why she's joined the workshop. And while we're talking about misleading, what kind of nonsense has she been spinning you about autoethnography? The woman raises one eyebrow and turns to look at the others in the room. They too are lost for words and sit in stunned silence. I can see this presentation is going to be similar to others you've given, performative. I do remember somewhere reading or someone telling me that you were a dancer in a former life, so it doesn't surprise me, she says, nudging the person sitting beside her. But seriously, is this performance of ethnography, of ethnomusicology, this autoethnography, is this proper social science? That is the question for us to consider today. Elizabeth had now had time to collect herself and musters up what she thought was a professional response. I was just about to get to that, and I'm glad you brought that up. Autoethnography certainly has its critics, and they can all get in line behind me, the woman interrupts. Excuse me, the organiser of the workshop leans forward and taps the woman on the shoulder. I'm wondering whether you would mind saving your comments and questions until the end. We're on a tight schedule today, and I think everyone here is keen to listen to what Elizabeth has to say. There is a pause. Everyone seems relieved that someone was brave enough to stop the woman in her tracks, and yet no one is quite sure what will happen next. Excuse me for forgetting. It is all about her, Elizabeth, this self she is proclaiming. The woman's voice is starting to rise, revving and roaring into traditional ethnographic gear. While you might be prepared to excuse me, I'm not prepared to excuse her. You see, whether I like it or not, and I happen to not like it, the self has always been present in ethnography, and the postmodern turn shifted our attention to issues of power, voice, authority and representation in the work that we do anyway, in, between and out of the field. These theoretical, philosophical and methodological debates certainly laid fertile ground for the growth of ethnography over the past few decades. Yes, Elizabeth agrees. Autoethnography too has grown up in a particular climate which insists that an understanding of others can only begin from our experiences ourselves. The I is always already there in ethnography. Autoethnography fesses up, lays bare and entangles the personal and its relationship to culture. Now don't get me started on that. The woman breathes out loudly in frustration. If the goal of social science, which you claim autoethnography to be an example of, is to study the social world, let me say that again, the social world. And yet the focus of autoethnographic research is the self. How on earth can it be considered valid and legitimate social science? Self-absorbed navel-gazing is what I'd call it. By the way, is your head of school here? The woman turns and looks around the room. He is, and cautiously raises his hand. Did you know this is what she does? Gets paid a generous salary to sit in her office obsessing about herself? Elizabeth's head of school squirms uncomfortably in the chair. What happened to you, Elizabeth? Why did you start writing like this? You used to be such a nice, dutiful daughter of traditional ethnographic and ethnomusicological method. I've read all your early papers and PhD on the social and musical lives of Aboriginal women at Borroloola. Such solid pieces of transcription and analytic research grounded in data from the field. Elizabeth is taken aback. She suspends the moment so she might think and wonder, takes a sip from her water glass before responding. Thanks for your question. What did you say your name was? The woman wags her finger. I didn't, and given that there has been no ethical understanding reached between us about the disclosure of my identity, I'm not sure I'm going to give it. I mean, that's another thing that really pisses me off. Oops, sorry. Am I allowed to say that? About autoethnographic research. It's basically unethical. Again, an important question about autoethnography, which we need to discuss. So perhaps if you let me continue with the presentation. No. The woman shakes her head again. No, you don't. You're not going to wriggle and worm your way out of this so easily. You know, in that paper that we read in preparation for this workshop that you wrote about your family and your work at Borroloola and death and dying, did you ask your family at Borroloola if you could describe the moments of their passing and the members of their family who had passed away in such an intimate way? Did you get permission? The woman narrows her eyes as she stares long and hard at Elizabeth. In fact, it seems to Elizabeth that the entire room now takes a slightly edgier and narrower look at her. The woman smirks. No, I didn't think so. And you dare to rant and rave about how autoethnography is more responsive and more response-able to the social condition and for bringing about social change. From where I stand, when you claim to do autoethnography, the only thing you are responsible for is standing on the wrong side of the fence. Because you cannot see beyond yourself. You can only focus on the powerful, you. It's the powerless to whom we should be directing our sociological gaze, and that is ignored. Autoethnography is ethically suspicious. That's what it is. Elizabeth has almost lost her patience. I think it's my turn to disagree with you. You see, from my experience, exactly. Autoethnography is all your experience. There is no data and therefore no analytic mileage. Research is supposed to be analytic, Elizabeth, not experiential, and autoethnography is noticeably lacking in analytic outcome once it starts flipping and flopping around with creativity and emotion. It abrogates our duty to go out and collect data as social scientists. We collect data and analyse. That's what we do. The woman gives a self-assured nod. Now, hang on a minute. If you could just let me respond. Elizabeth tries to intervene. Oh, yes. It's all about you in autoethnography, isn't it? It's just a little too familiar, subjective and evocative for my liking. And quite simply, we, you as selves are not interesting enough to write about in journals, to teach about or to expect any attention from others. Well, you are certainly giving us plenty of attention now, so it can't be all that useless, hopeless and boring, Elizabeth mutters. The important sociological questions are not about your anguish, and most autoethnography is angst-ridden autobiography devoid of any obligation to the people and cultures who share their lives with us, so that we as ethnographers can research and write about them. The woman waves her arms around for emphasis. Sorry, I didn't do that. There is a line when studying social phenomena that you do not cross, the line that says there is an appropriate and beneficial amount of autobiography and reflexivity in ethnographic projects, and an inappropriate amount. No prize for guessing which side of the line autoethnography falls on. I'm not sure I would make such broad, sweeping generalisations. The woman disregards Elizabeth's comment and continues her denunciation of autoethnography. Let me remind you that sociologists, anthropologists, ethnomusicologists, and anyone else who engages in ethnographic work are a privileged group. For example, qualitative sociologists are particularly lucky as our work lasts. Think about those texts sociology is remembered for. The great ethnographies. City of Women by Landers is a ripping read. Autoethnography is an abuse of that privilege. Our duty is to go out and research the classic texts of 2050 or 2090, not sit in our homes focusing on ourselves. I'm not sure if that's what I've said we do. If you read, Elizabeth tries to speak, but the woman's criticism is reaching fever pitch. I'm sorry, actually strike that. I'm not sorry about anything I've said here. Your responses and the way you are presenting autoethnography are mischievous. Some would say mendacious even. Elizabeth is momentarily caught up in thinking and wondering about the etymology of the word mendacious, a word aimed at catching the very lying quality it alludes to. Now, that's a fairly serious kind of accusation. Would you care to elaborate? The woman has barely drawn breath. You're nothing but bricoleurs, tricksters. You assert, exaggerate, speculate, improvise, and don't test out ideas. Autoethnographers are essentially lazy. Yes, literally lazy and intellectually lazy. And what's more, you all think that by being artistic and creative, you are performing science. You might want to call me a dinosaur waiting to get hit by a meteor for that statement, but at least I'm not deluding myself into thinking that autoethnography as story is a more ethical practice. I mean... She scoffs and sounds a little like a horse with a bad cough. Most of you can't even write well. You're just second-rate writers and poets. Of all the offensive things the woman has said, Elizabeth takes offence to this and goes on the offence. Most autoethnographers I know spend a lot of time writing and crafting their work in much the same way as a novelist would, and I certainly don't think that could be called lazy. And as for your stories, or what is it that you started calling them? Storylines, heartlines, they are nothing more than ethnographic lies. The woman saw the horror-stricken look on Elizabeth's face and went straight for the jugular. The only honest thing to do is not to do ethnography at all. Elizabeth is left speechless. Given that you seem incapable of responding in an objective way to my suggestions about the ethics of autoethnography, I think it's time I left. The room is quiet, so quiet that Elizabeth is sure everyone must be able to hear how fast her heart is racing as it sinks heavily to the floor. Very well then, I'll be going. The woman stands up from her chair and turns to address the audience. Come on then, aren't you coming with me? Her invitation is met with silence. Suit yourselves, but remember, I could very well be one of the reviewers next time you submit an article to a social science journal, and mark my words, if you send anything remotely or closely autoethnographic, I will not be recommending publication. It's your funeral. Elizabeth waited until the last of the staff and students attending the workshop had left the room before sitting down heavily on the nearest chair, her breathing shallow and fast. In that moment, she felt as though she had become the embodiment of the woman as trampled space, her lovely mouth gagged with pollen and the wind knocked out of her. The accusatory words hurled by the woman at her had cut right through to the raw and ragged uncertainty she held as an autoethnographer about doing autoethnography. The woman's parting condemnation of autoethnography as a dishonest way of researching and writing caused her to wince even now as it played over and over in her head. That particular comment was designed to hurt. It did hurt, and Elizabeth's autoethnographic sensibilities were smarting and with the caustic sting it had left in its wake. Very loudly and very publicly, the woman had deemed autoethnography and Elizabeth as unethical. The word unethical twisted around her thoughts uneasily. Not ethical, in lack of ethics, without ethics, in opposition and reverse action to that which is ethical, deprived of ethics, released from ethics. It didn't matter which way Elizabeth returned it, she couldn't shake the dis-ease that the woman's words had set into motion. If there was no shedding it, perhaps, Elizabeth began to think and wonder. She was then meant to sit with it. After all, that is one of the purposes of autoethnographic work, to make space for a turn, a return, a change, a reconsideration of how we think, how we do, and how we be in relation and how we live. Dear unnamed dame of the MacArthur River, I begin this letter by saying sorry. I do not know how else to begin, for it is with the most profound sadness and shame that I am unable, again, to begin this letter addressing you by your name. After many years of searching, I still do not know your name. I took your photograph with me to Borroloola when I first went there 26 years ago, as promised, and showed your image to all of your family. Kura, a body, they said. She looks like my grandmother, they said. She might be your cousin, or she could belong to that sister of your mother's, they said. Kura, a body, they said. And then they cried, long and hard for you. I think they might still be crying. I was talking about you only last month with my son Hamish. You might have called him grandson as we hiked on Gubbi Gubbi and Jinnaburra country in Mapleton National Park, north of Brisbane on the Sunshine Coast. Hiking is our time together on the weekends, and I was explaining to him how in the book I'm writing about autoethnography, I want to say something about my work at Borroloola as deeply ethical work, as kind ethico-onto-epistemological heartline work, and the reason why I now write the way I do. I write this way now because of you, a buddy, because of the photograph I found all of those years ago, and because I still do not know your name. I told Hamish that I don't know why your family took me in and held me close, so close, and shared songs and experiences, stories and knowledges, words and a world I am not sure I had a right to be in as a white settler colonial woman, nor for that matter to write about as a white settler colonial woman. Straight out of the mouths of babes then, Hamish wastes no time in getting to the point. So why did you then? He asked. Why did you go there? And why do you write about my family? These are questions I ask myself over and over again, and yet still not nearly enough, for I still do not have answers, not answers that are wide, wise and well made enough to care for and carry the fragile weight they hold. Those are really big questions, Hamish. I begin with a dodge. And he refused my refusal to respond. I'm not proud of it. I felt the shame of white race power and privilege begin to itch and scratch in uncomfortable places again. I went because I could. I had the means, the motivation and the mandate from the university to fill the musical gap in the ethnographic record, to document, to preserve and to represent the sung world of Yanuagaro, Amara and Gurangi people. Just because you could go, does that mean you should have gone there? How are you different to that guy, that Raiko Baiko guy you were telling me about, who took the photograph of that old buddy, that unnamed dame? My youngest son has always been an old soul, quietly, patiently and gently diving as deep as he might to understand. No, but I try to make myself feel better by telling myself it was fine because I went with your family, your Nana Jeannie and your Goody Hilda. They came with me the first time I went to Borroloola. Right from the beginning, my being there was not just professional but personal, deeply personal. So that explains the being there part, he continued, but what about the writing? Oh, the writing. I did what I was expected to do at first. I wrote my PhD, I wrote journal articles. I like to write, and I wrote a lot. But they feel like empty words now when I read them, wasted and wasteful because of what they could never have possibly hoped to hold. I knew even as I was writing them that they were not enough because they were bereft of life. They were without a relational rhythm. How could they possibly live? So what you're trying to say then is that your academic writing was dead? Well, death was certainly knocking on the door. My writing was fast becoming a flat line when it needed to become the heart line. In accepting the gift of being in relationality with our family offered me, there was no other way to be. I needed to write heart lines, to breathe life back into my words and writing, to recognise that maybe this was the gift I had been given, and this was the gift that I had which might make it possible to reciprocate. You see, being in relationality with Yanyuwa Garo Amara and Guranji women was and always will be a gift given to me, a white settler colonial woman, about ways of being, doing and knowing as Aboriginal women in the world through song. I'm filled to overflowing with a reciprocal sense and responsibility to return everything I've been given full circle. I half smile, with regret, despair or hope, I cannot be sure, as I share my conversation with Hamish with you. Writing in relationality with, writing as an autoethnographer, I think and wonder, might be the most respectful, sense and responsible and ethical way I can reciprocate, I can give back to you, Bari. Got ethics, I hear you ask? Gura Bari, your family cries. I pick up my pen to begin, to unforget origins, to know, to return to roots, to recognise, to unbury that which lies beneath, to admit, to unearth the silences, to confess, to stop death with life, to act, to write in a gesture of love, to story, to restoration, to be gifted, to reciprocate, to be in relationality with. Bawajibara Yinda Gundiara. Thank you. Thank you. Don't know if you have any questions. Did I cover enough of ethics and autoethnography, Denis, for you? To not throw it all away? I think it is actually that overwhelming sense of responsibility that I'm still, even now, I'm still amazed at why people at Borroloola accepted me with such generosity. That was such a gift. I wrote a letter in academic English to a group of people whose English was probably their fifth language. I don't think they even read it. But that was my way of getting ethics. And so it always strikes me as now the chair of ethics in various places that when I was applying for ethical clearance as a PhD student, that was my ethical clearance, writing that letter. That was it. No form, no HRIA, no review committee. And I often think, why? Why did people make it possible for me to do that work? And it's just this overwhelming sense of responsibility that, and I've written a little bit about this in a chapter I'm writing at the moment about my arrival at Borroloola, and one old lady said, well, we haven't given all this to you for nothing. It would be the most, disrespectful thing if you wasted it and you did nothing with it. But the idea of writing about culture, as I did when I first did my early ethnomusicology work, from that very distant traditional ethnographic stance, just doesn't, it fills me with this unease, the itching and scratching of white colonial privilege and that gaze. So autoethnography for me has found a way for me to continue the work and to actually ask the difficult questions about the work that we do. And if I hadn't done that, I think I probably would have thrown it all away. But just feeling like we have to be having this conversation. We really do. And I don't know why we're not having it. It's a very uncomfortable conversation. As soon as that's why I started with that thing, God ethics, because everyone kind of starts to, squiggle and squirm a little bit. And my experience of being at ethnomusicology conferences is that no one talks about ethics. What goes on in the field stays, nobody talks about it. And so just that idea that, well, why aren't we talking about it? This is about relationships, and I think that's part of the issue. So I guess the way I've worked with it is to try to tangle up, but unentangle all of those things about the relationships that form, and how without the relationship we can't do the work, and how we might bring that relationality into our writing so that people reading the work begin to not just read it and think and read the words and think they understand, but feel something. And I guess too, like I was writing, all these wonderful papers about Aboriginal lullabies and the musical structure of particular songs, and I did my transcription, and anyone here familiar with Aboriginal ethnomusicology? I'm sure, Denis, you've heard Linda Barwick and Alan Marritz of the world talking about rhythmic codes and all kinds of things, and I did all of that work. And then I guess, I knew that wasn't a story that my family were interested in. Talking about rhythmic structure, melodic encoding and pentatonic scales, that meant nothing to the people. That wasn't a reciprocal gift I was writing. So now I guess I started to think about, how do I write stories that are a 1-2 story, my story and their story together? How do I write that so that it has meaning on so many levels? And that I decided that the stories I was writing were not good enough anymore because they weren't telling a story for my family. And if they don't do that, it doesn't do that, then it's not a good enough story. It's never going to be a good enough story. And not everyone agrees with me about that, but certainly that's been my approach.
One of the accusations that was leveraged against you in that conference was about, I guess, using the incidental conversations and things that happen.
Yeah.
And I know that this is something you do manage ethically, but I'm wondering if you could elaborate for everyone on how you do that and how you manage that, like, conversations.
Okay, so I'll just put some context into that workshop. So it was actually a workshop I gave here at UQ. But the woman is actually an academic who writes very much in opposition to autoethnography. She writes journal papers about it. So some of the quotes from her are from that paper. But what I did in the workshop was I put in a plant. So I invited someone from another department that no one knew to be that woman. So when I started doing the workshop, my friend was performing and kept putting her hand up and saying all of this stuff. And then no one knew that she was the plant. And it was just amazing to watch the reaction from people getting really upset with her because she was interrupting. And then eventually, of course, we said, well, it's actually a setup. She's not really, she actually is on side. But it was a really interesting kind of performative, kind of to practice what you preach. So... but for me, the way that I do that, and this is something I know, Denis, you and I were having a bit of a chat about a little while ago, I think, around the self and the social in autoethnography. It's a self and it's a social, so we're always writing about our interactions with other people, and that's where the ethics comes in. And so my practice is always that anything I write that does involve other people, they see it, that they read it, and they're happy with that. So my son Hamish... he likes to talk about writing. He's very engaged with what I'm writing at any point, especially now because we're all working from home, and he sees all the books that are sitting on my desk. So anything I write, for example, that would include him, he gets to see, and he would edit. He does edit. I would say that. I wouldn't have said it like that. This is how I would have said. So he kind of... So for me, that's always been the way. And it's not unlike, it's like that's the ethnographic part of the work that we do. If we're going to engage others in our autoethnographic work, we have to do the ethical follow-through, which is to share what we're writing with the people that we're talking about. And there's some really prominent examples of people where they haven't done that. And one of them, if you know anything about the big thinkers and movers and shakers in autoethnography was Carolyn Ellis. When she first did her very first bit of social science, sociological writing, she wrote about a fishing village, and she wrote about some of the interactions with people in a really derogatory and negative way, and included, verbatim kinds of conversations and interactions, and people recognised themselves in the book and got very, very upset about it. And of course, that was very early in her academic career, and she's since changed the way she thinks about the work that she does. But it's a risk in any ethnographic research and interview research, or including stories of other people. And I would like to think that autoethnography, because of the attention to the self and the social, does take an ethical stance on that, which is why I disagree with the woman who says it's unethical to do autoethnography. We just fundamentally disagree about that. In fact, I would argue that if an ethnographic piece is not including the self, that's basically unethical too, because the self is always engaged in ethnographic work. And if you want to look at it in that perspective, autoethnography is more ethical, because it's fessing up about the relationship between self and the social selves and others. So that's one way of, but it would always be, so making sure that in your planning and practice around any written project that you've got time to share with people what you're writing.
I just wanted to quickly ask you about the Denis that you had mentioned earlier. Is there a certain aspect of accepting what people say in terms of the permission at face value, and potentially reanalyzing later as a symptom or manifestation of the power, dynamics that are there between the cultures, and potentially then considering the problems and the privilege that we have can sort of come across as maybe patronising. And if someone is interested in you exploring the culture, if you're then going back and saying, but actually we're still here somewhere, and we have to balance the dynamic. It's not always led by them, it's kind of led by the culture. Sort of reinforces it with the language.
Yeah, I mean, it's... Yeah. So are you asking around the process of...
What brings on the feelings of angst after someone's already given them permission to be there and do the work?
Yeah. I guess in my case, I don't know. Didn't he give permission? He was happy that I had a tape recorder. He was a person, when I think about the timing, so we're talking about the early 90s in a very remote part of Aboriginal Australia. That community, in terms of colonisation processes, really had only started to impact from the 1960s onwards, when the cattle industry dropped, when people started to be moved onto cattle, forcibly moved around through the cattle industry as, stockmen and domestic servants and things like that. And so when I went to Borroloola, there was still one person alive who could remember time before white people at Borroloola. So, the people that I worked with in those early days, I know they understood what was going on. They knew that the recording on this, and it was a big Naga at that point, it wasn't like a nice handy little iPhone, so it was really obvious that I had this recording equipment. They knew what was happening, that it was going to be recorded. But that old man, he sang for 3 months every day, and he sang because his world was a sung world. He lived his world through song, and he wanted to sing, and he wanted to sing his country. And sometimes I think about that, and I think this man is singing not because of wanting to get it in an archive or so that I can write an analytical paper. He's writing it because his spirit, his soul is alive because of song. His country is alive because of song. And then it, I guess the unease comes with, well, yes, he's giving permission because we're sitting here and he's put, he signed a permission slip saying with an X because he can't write his name. And he said, yes, you can have these songs on tape. But he's not thinking about the research. He's thinking about how much the song means to him and his family and his country. Whereas at that point, what am I thinking about? The first time I pressed record on that Nagra, I wasn't thinking about the country or the spirituality or what it meant. I had no idea. Not really. I mean, I'd read all of Carolyn Ellis's work and done all the reading, and I knew that song was central to Indigenous people's way of being in the world. I actually really had no idea until I'd spent time being in relationship with people. And then it made me rethink, well, what am I doing here? Like, they don't need me to write an analytical paper about.
I guess what I'm saying is that sort of idea that was like created within like the primary within like culture as a type of guilt or something like that, and then the idea of documentation the media sort of focus on sometimes, where it was potentially within the culture, unless someone had come out and said we don't want you to do this or we think this is bad, don't do this.
Yeah. What's wrong with it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think not everyone. So just as an example, during my first field trip there was a funeral ceremony being held, and permission was given for me to audio record the ceremony, but we had a video camera, but people didn't want it to be videoed because they just felt that the imagery that's associated with videos and photographs was not okay. The song was all right. But there was division. Some people wanted it and some people didn't. And that became a really difficult context to navigate. But yeah, I think you're right. I mean, across generations of people, there can be varying degrees. So, older people at Borroloola, for example, might say, yes, please put this on the tape because I want my grandchildren to be able to listen to it. But another generation might say, well, you're just a white fella, what are you doing here? Don't humbug my grandmother. Are you paying her properly? What are you going to do with that? We'll never see it again. And I guess one of the distressing things about taking that photograph back, as well as other recordings that were held at the Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies Institute down in Canberra, where people didn't know. They didn't know that all of this archival material about their family existed. So they didn't know there was that photograph of that lady. I took back tapes and tapes that a woman called Mari Ray had made in the 60s at Borroloola. People could remember the anthropologist being there, but they didn't remember that she'd done the recording. And they were saying, where'd you get these tapes? Where are these from? We didn't even know. Are there more? Not really knowing. So I guess that's part of, yeah, and I guess it's, I suppose the thing is that you learn, what we need to learn is to get better at the consultation, the negotiation, the transparency with what it is that we're doing. But yeah, there's no easy answer to any of those questions. And it's not that people say all research is bad. That's not it at all. But I guess, when I think about just the circumstances of the ways that I got to go to Borroloola, yeah, that's what's uncomfortable. It's a good question. Excellent. Thanks, everyone.
So thank you so very much to Liz and Denis both for providing really enlightening and engaging keynotes for us today. It's been a real privilege to have both of them here. This now concludes the publicly streamed component of the symposium. Thank you so much to all of you online who've joined us throughout the morning. We hope that you've enjoyed it. It's certainly been a wonderful privilege for us to sit here in this room, and we hope that that's something that you're able to feel as well, wherever you might be sitting at the moment. So thank you very much for coming along, and hopefully we will see you at another event, whether that be in person in the School of Music or online, in an online mode. So thank you very much. Can we please just finish with a final round of applause for our keynotes?